In a small town gripped by prejudice and fear, a late-night arrest of a 10-year-old boy sends shockwaves through the community. Elijah Williams stands accused of breaking into a pharmacy, but behind his alleged crimes lies a story that will challenge everything the townspeople think they know. As he was taken away and the community calls for harsh punishment, no one suspects the devastating truth that's about to unfold. But what drove this young boy to commit these crimes? And why does he remain silent in the face of mounting accusations? The answer will stun a courtroom and force an entire town to confront its own conscience. Before we dive into this heartbreaking story of love, survival, and redemption, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world. The crack of splintering wood shattered the midnight silence. 10-year-old Elijah Williams jolted awake, his heart hammering against his ribs as flashlight beams cut through the darkness of his bedroom. "Police! Don't move!" The harsh command froze him in place, his small hands trembling as they clutched his thin blanket. Heavy footsteps thundered through the house, accompanied by the sound of doors being thrown open. "Check every room," a deep voice commanded. Elijah's first thought wasn't of himself. It was of Ava. His 4-year-old sister's bedroom was just down the hall, and he could already hear her frightened cries beginning to pierce the chaos. "Elijah!" Her terrified voice made him forget all about staying still. He leaped from his bed, but before he could reach his door, 2 officers burst in, their flashlights blinding him. "Got him!" Suspect located. Rough hands seized his skinny arms, and Elijah struggled against their grip. "Please, my sister. I need to check on my sister." "Stay still, kid," one officer commanded, while his partner read him his rights in a monotone voice that suggested he'd done this too many times before. Through the commotion, Elijah caught glimpses of his home being torn apart. Officers rifled through drawers, overturned furniture, and examined every corner with scrutinizing eyes. Their mother was nowhere to be seen, probably passed out again, he thought bitterly. "Found them." Another officer emerged from the bathroom, holding up a plastic bag filled with various medicine bottles. Same stuff that was stolen from Carlton's pharmacy. Elijah's shoulders slumped. He stopped struggling. "Elijah!" Ava's cry came closer as she appeared in his doorway, her small frame illuminated by the harsh police lights. Her dark curls were messier than usual, her favorite purple pajamas wrinkled from sleep. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to run to him, but a female officer caught her gently. "It's okay, sweetheart," the officer soothed, but Ava was inconsolable. "Don't take him. Please don't take my brother." She reached for him with desperate hands, and Elijah felt his heart breaking. "It's okay, Ava," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Everything's going to be fine. Remember what I told you? Be brave for me, okay?" A social worker appeared behind Ava, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair who introduced herself as Miss Thompson. She knelt beside the crying child, speaking in soft tones, but Ava's eyes remained fixed on her brother as the officers began leading him away. Outside, red and blue lights painted the neighborhood in alternating colors. A small crowd had already gathered, drawn by the commotion. Elijah recognized them all. These were people he'd grown up around, people who had watched him playing in these streets since he was Ava's age. Mrs. Martinez from next door stood on her porch in her bathrobe, shaking her head. "I knew that boy would end up like this," she muttered to her husband. "Just like his father." "Such a shame," Mr. Peterson from across the street agreed. "But what do you expect? No supervision, running wild at all hours. I've caught him in my yard 3 times this month alone." The whispers followed Elijah as the officers led him to their patrol car. He could hear snippets of conversations, each one a dagger to his heart. Breaking into the pharmacy, can you believe it? Always knew he was trouble. Lost cause, just like his mother. Stealing food from the grocery store last month. That graffiti at the school. Elijah kept his head down, but he could feel their stares burning into him. These were the same people who had once smiled at him on his way to school, who had complimented his mother on what a polite young man he was. Now they looked at him like he was something dangerous, something to be feared. The news vans arrived before the police car even left the neighborhood. Reporters thrust microphones toward the officers, their cameras rolling as they captured the scene of a 10-year-old boy in handcuffs being placed in the back of a patrol car. Sources say this is the same juvenile who's been terrorizing local businesses, one reporter announced into her camera. The suspect, whose name is being withheld due to his age, is believed to be responsible for a string of crimes including vandalism, theft, and now breaking and entering. Back at the house, Ava's screams had turned to heartbreaking sobs as Ms. Thompson tried to comfort her. "I want Elijah. Please. I need my brother." "Sweetheart, you need to eat something," Ms. Thompson urged, holding out a granola bar she'd pulled from her bag. But Ava pushed it away, curling into herself on the worn couch. "Not hungry," she whimpered. "Want Elijah." Ms. Thompson exchanged worried glances with her colleague. They'd seen many cases of separated siblings, but something about this one felt different. The way the little girl clung to her brother's name, the desperate look in the boy's eyes when they'd taken him away. There was more to this story. The following morning, the local news station ran the story as their leading headline. "Juvenile delinquent terrorizes local businesses. Community demands action." The segment showed security footage from Carlton's pharmacy, a grainy black and white video of a small figure breaking in through a back window. It cut to interviews with local business owners, each one more outraged than the last. "This isn't just about one break-in," declared Mr. Carlton, the pharmacy owner, his face red with anger. "This is about the safety of our community. This boy has been causing trouble for months. First it was stealing food, then vandalizing the school, and now this? Where does it end?" Sarah Chun, owner of the local grocery store, nodded in agreement. "He stole from my store last month. Just walked right in and took bread and milk, bold as anything. When I confronted him, he ran. No remorse, no shame, nothing." The story sparked a firestorm of comments on local social media pages. Residents called for harsh punishment, citing the need to make an example before other children followed suit. Some even suggested trying him as an adult, despite his age. At the juvenile detention center, Elijah sat in a stark holding cell, his small frame nearly swallowed by the orange jumpsuit they'd given him. His public defender, Mr. Rodriguez, sat across from him, frustration evident in his tired eyes. "Elijah, I need you to work with me here," Mr. Rodriguez pleaded. "They're pushing for a swift trial. Judge Harrison has agreed to hear the case next week, and he's not known for his leniency with repeat offenders." Elijah stared at the floor, his fingers tracing the edges of a crumpled piece of paper he'd been allowed to keep. It was a drawing Ava had made for him last week. A simple picture of the two of them holding hands under a bright sun, with the wobbly letters spelling out "Best Brother Ever" in purple crayon. "The evidence against you is pretty strong," Mr. Rodriguez continued. "The security footage, the stolen medicine found in your home, your previous incidents. If you don't speak up, if you don't give me something to work with, I can't help you." But Elijah remained silent, his eyes fixed on Ava's drawing. A single tear dropped onto the paper, making the purple crayon run slightly. Mr. Rodriguez sighed, gathering his papers. "The trial is set for next Tuesday. Judge Harrison already has your file, and I won't lie to you. He's not impressed. He sees cases like yours all the time. Kids who start with small crimes and escalate to bigger ones. Without your cooperation, he's likely to throw the book at you, even at your age." As his lawyer's footsteps echoed down the corridor, Elijah finally looked up. Through the small window of his cell, he could see a slice of sky, the same sky Ava would be looking at. He wondered if she was okay, if she was eating, if she was scared without him there. The sound of approaching footsteps made him quickly wipe his eyes. It was Officer Jenkins, one of the guards who'd been assigned to the juvenile wing. Unlike most of the others, she didn't look at him like he was a criminal. Sometimes she even smiled at him. "Lights out in 10 minutes, Elijah," she announced, but then her voice softened. "Your social worker called. She wanted me to tell you that your sister is safe. They've placed her with a temporary foster family until things get sorted out." Elijah's head snapped up, panic flashing across his face. "Foster family? But she needs to be home. She needs—" He caught himself, falling silent again. Officer Jenkins watched him curiously, noting how his hands tightened around the drawing, how his small shoulders trembled with suppressed emotion. "You know," she said carefully, "sometimes being brave means asking for help. Sometimes it means speaking up, even when it's scary." But Elijah turned away, curling up on his thin mattress with Ava's drawing pressed against his chest. As the lights dimmed in the juvenile wing, he whispered a promise into the darkness, his voice barely audible. "I'll fix this, Ava. I promise. Just be brave a little longer." In his chambers, Judge Harrison reviewed Elijah's file one last time before heading home. His lips pressed into a thin line as he read through the list of offenses: shoplifting, vandalism, trespassing, and now breaking and entering. The judge had seen this pattern before, too many times to count. Young offenders who started small and graduated to more serious crimes, usually ending up in the adult system eventually. Another one headed down the wrong path, he muttered, closing the file with a decisive snap. He'd seen enough troubled youth to recognize the signs, and in his experience, swift and stern consequences were the only way to attempt course correction. But as he drove home that night, passing through the poorest section of town where Elijah lived, something made him slow down. In the gathering darkness, he saw children playing in front of rundown houses, their laughter a stark contrast to the desperation that seemed to cling to every peeling paint job and broken window. For just a moment, he thought about Elijah Williams, sitting alone in his cell. But then he shook his head, pushing the image away. Sympathy had no place in justice, he reminded himself. The law was the law, and actions had consequences, no matter how young the offender might be. What no one knew, what no one could see, was that in his cold cell, Elijah Williams was fighting a battle far different from what they imagined. As he clutched Ava's drawing and whispered promises into the dark, he carried a weight no 10-year-old should have to bear. The truth about his crimes, about his desperate choices, about the real reason behind every rule he'd broken. It was all there, waiting to be told. But for now, he remained silent, protecting a secret that would soon shake an entire community to its core. The juvenile courtroom felt impossibly large to 10-year-old Elijah Williams. He sat at the defendant's table, his orange jumpsuit making him look even smaller than he was, his feet barely touching the floor. The wooden chair creaked beneath him as he shifted nervously, trying not to look at the growing crowd filing into the public seats behind him. District Attorney Margaret Chin rose from her seat, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the jury box. Her tailored suit and stern expression exuded confidence as she began her opening statement. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "The case before you today may seem unusual given the defendant's age, but make no mistake, the gravity of these crimes demands our fullest attention." She picked up a laser pointer, directing it to a large screen where images began to appear. Over the past 3 months, our community has experienced a disturbing pattern of criminal behavior, all traced back to one source, Elijah Williams. The first image showed a list of dates and incidents. DA Chin ticked them off one by one. February 15th, shoplifting from Greens Market. March 3rd, vandalism at Roosevelt Elementary School. March 18th, trespassing and attempted theft at Wilson's Hardware. March 25th, breaking and entering at Peterson's convenience store. And finally, April 12th, the brazen break-in at Carlton's Pharmacy, where dangerous prescription medications were stolen. Mr. Rodriguez, Elijah's public defender, noticed his young client's shoulders tensing with each mentioned incident. He placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's arm, but the boy remained rigid, his eyes fixed on the table before him. D.A. Chin's voice grew more emphatic. "But it's the pharmacy incident that truly demonstrates the escalating nature of these crimes." She gestured to a new image on the screen, security camera footage showing a small figure breaking through the pharmacy's back window. What you're witnessing isn't just a simple act of vandalism or theft. The defendant specifically targeted the pharmacy's prescription medication storage. She held up an evidence bag containing various pill bottles. These were found in the defendant's home. Powerful medications that could have caused serious harm if distributed or misused. From his elevated bench, Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed as he studied the exhibit. He'd seen plenty of drug-related cases, but usually with much older defendants. The prosecutor continued, clicking to the next piece of evidence. "Let's examine the school vandalism incident from March 3rd. The screen showed photographs of Roosevelt Elementary's exterior wall, covered in crude spray-painted letters. M.S. Davis is mean to kids. The red paint had dripped down the brick like tears, or blood, as D.H. and would later suggest. At approximately 11:30 p.m., security cameras captured this footage. The video showed a small figure in a hoodie, working quickly with a spray can. The defendant broke into school grounds after hours, armed with spray paint, and defaced school property with what we contend was a threatening message directed at a teacher. Ms. Davis, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, sat in the gallery, nodding vigorously. She'd been teaching 4th grade for 25 years and had never, she would later testify, encountered such a troubled child. The evidence presentation continued with security footage from Green's Market. The grainy video showed Elijah slipping a loaf of bread under his oversized jacket, then grabbing a half-gallon of milk. He looked directly at the camera for a moment, and even in the poor-quality footage, his expression was clear, not defiant or mischievous, but something else entirely. Sarah Green, the store owner, stood to testify next. She smoothed her apron as she took the oath, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. "I've owned Green's Market for 30 years, she began, and I've caught my share of shoplifters. But this one was different. So bold about it. When I confronted him, he just ran. Didn't even try to deny it. And did you notice anything unusual about his behavior before the theft?" D.H. asked. Mrs. Green's expression softened slightly. "Well, he'd been hanging around the store a lot. Sometimes just standing in the bread aisle, staring at the shelves. I thought maybe he was casing the place, you know. But what, Mrs. Green?" She shook her head. "Nothing. It doesn't matter now. He's clearly a lost cause." From his seat, Elijah's hands clenched in a fist under the table, but his face remained carefully blank. The parade of witnesses continued as neighbor after neighbor took the stand. Mr. Peterson, a retired postal worker, testified about finding Elijah in his backyard at midnight. "Found him digging through my garbage cans," Mr. Peterson declared, his weathered face reddening with indignation. "When I called out, he scattered like a stray cat. Been happening for weeks. Noise in the yard. Things moved around. Had to install security lights because of him." Mrs. Martinez, who lived next door to Elijah, spoke next. "All hours of the night. That boy was coming and going. No supervision at all. I tried talking to his mother, but—" She trailed off, shooting a disapproving look at Elijah. "It's no wonder he turned out like this." Throughout the testimony, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Residents who'd known Elijah since he was a toddler now shook their heads and clicked their tongues, seeing only a criminal where once they'd seen a child. "He used to be such a sweet boy," whispered Mrs. Thompson, who ran the corner store. "But you know how it goes. Bad blood will tell. Just like his father," someone else muttered. "Remember that whole mess?" The whispers grew louder until Judge Harrison had to bang his gavel. "Order in the court. D.H. and save her most dramatic evidence for last." She played the complete security footage from Carlton's pharmacy, showing Elijah's entire break-in. The video showed him testing windows, finding one loose, and squeezing through the narrow opening. Inside, he moved with purpose, heading straight for the prescription area. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chin addressed the jury, "this was no random act of vandalism. The defendant knew exactly what he was after. He specifically targeted medications, controlled substances that could have ended up anywhere, caused any amount of harm. This level of premeditation, this escalation from simple theft to breaking and entering, from shoplifting food to stealing drugs, it paints a clear picture of a young offender on a dangerous path." Mr. Rodriguez stood to object. "Your Honor, the prosecution is speculating about my client's intentions without." "Sustained," Judge Harrison interrupted. "The jury will disregard the prosecutor's characterization of the defendant's motives." But the damage was done. The jurors' faces showed they'd already made up their minds about Elijah's character. Throughout the proceedings, Elijah remained silent, his eyes downcast. Mr. Rodriguez had tried repeatedly to get him to speak up, to explain his actions, but the boy seemed to retreat further into himself with each new piece of evidence. During a brief recess, Mr. Rodriguez made one last attempt to reach his young client. In a small conference room, he sat across from Elijah, his voice gentle but urgent. "Elijah, they're building a strong case against you. The jury sees all these incidents, but they don't know your side of the story. Help me understand. Help me help you." Elijah traced patterns on the table with his finger, refusing to meet his lawyer's eyes. "Was it for attention? Were you angry about something? There must be a reason for all this." Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Mr. Rodriguez urged. But Elijah just shook his head, and that was the last word he spoke for the rest of the day. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harrison's patience was wearing thin. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, young offenders playing tough, refusing to show remorse. But something about this case nagged at him, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. "Young man," he addressed Elijah directly, his deep voice filling the courtroom. "Your silence does you no favors. This court has heard substantial evidence of your crimes, yet you offer no explanation, no defense. If you continue this way, you leave me very few options in terms of sentencing." Elijah's hands trembled slightly, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. The judge leaned forward, his tone shifting from stern to almost pleading. "Son, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've seen where this path leads. Right now, you have a chance to change course, to help us understand. But I can't help you if you won't help yourself." In the gallery, Ms. Thompson, the social worker, watched with growing concern. She'd been taking notes throughout the trial, and something wasn't adding up. The timing of the crimes, the specific items stolen, the locations targeted. There was a pattern here that nobody seemed to be seeing. She glanced down at her notebook, where she jotted down questions that nagged at her. Why food and medicine specifically? Late-night activities. Where was his mother? Connection to sister's needs? School incident. Timing matches sister starting kindergarten? But before she could pursue these thoughts, D.A. Chun was delivering her closing arguments for the day. "Your Honor, members of the jury, the evidence speaks for itself. We have video footage, eyewitness testimony, and physical evidence, all pointing to a disturbing pattern of escalating criminal behavior. The defendant's continued silence only underscores his lack of remorse or responsibility." She gestured to Elijah, who seemed to shrink further into his chair. "While his age may evoke sympathy, we must consider the safety of our community. Today it's breaking into a pharmacy. What will it be tomorrow? The time to intervene is now, before these crimes escalate further." As the day's session drew to a close, Judge Harrison made one final observation. "Mr. Williams, you'll have another chance to address this court tomorrow. I strongly suggest you reconsider your silence. Justice must be served, but it need not be blind to circumstances, if you're willing to share them." The bailiff led Elijah back to his holding cell, where he would spend another night alone with his thoughts. As he passed the gallery, he caught a glimpse of Ms. Thompson scribbling in her notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. For a moment, their eyes met, and Ms. Thompson saw something in his expression that stopped her pen mid-stroke. It wasn't defiance or anger she saw in those young eyes. It was fear. Not fear of punishment, but something deeper, more desperate. As the courtroom emptied, the whispers continued. Poor Judge Harrison, having to deal with such a hopeless case. They should make an example of him. If only someone had stepped in sooner. Just another bad kid from the wrong side of town. But in her notes, Miss Thompson circled one question repeatedly. What are we missing? The answer was there, hidden beneath layers of assumptions and prejudices, waiting to break free. But for now, Elijah Williams returned to his cell, carrying his secrets like a shield, protecting something or someone that meant more to him than his own freedom. In his chambers, Judge Harrison reviewed his notes from the day, struggling to reconcile the evidence presented with the silent, frightened boy he'd observed. 20 years on the bench had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this case felt unfinished, like a story being told with crucial chapters missing. But unless Elijah chose to fill in those missing pages, the judge's hands were tied. Justice would proceed, blind to the truth that lay just beneath the surface, waiting to change everything. The night was bitterly cold for April. Behind Pete's Diner, 10-year-old Elijah Williams pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders as he carefully lifted the lid of the dumpster. The metal was icy against his fingers, but he barely noticed anymore. This was his third stop of the night. Please, he whispered to no one in particular. Just let there be something good this time. The beam of his dollar store flashlight revealed the usual mess of coffee grounds and vegetable peelings. But there, wrapped in relatively clean paper, were several half-eaten hamburgers and a container of French fries. Elijah's stomach growled at the sight, but he pushed the sensation aside. These weren't for him. With practiced movements, he pulled a clean plastic bag from his pocket and carefully transferred the food. Pete's Diner always had the best leftovers because the owner insisted on throwing out anything not eaten by closing time. Elijah had memorized the schedule of every restaurant in walking distance, knew exactly when to check each dumpster for the freshest discards. As he worked, his mind wandered to Ava at home. Was she still awake? Had she managed to fall asleep despite her empty stomach? The thought spurred him to move faster. A noise from the back door made him freeze. Light spilled out as Pete himself emerged, carrying another trash bag. Elijah pressed himself against the dumpster's far side, holding his breath. "Damned raccoons again," Pete muttered, tossing the bag in and heading back inside. Elijah waited until the door closed before letting out his breath. He'd been mistaken for a raccoon more times than he could count. Sometimes he thought maybe that's what he was becoming, a scavenger, living on society's scraps. The walk home was treacherous. He stuck to the shadows, avoiding the well-lit main streets where someone might recognize him. The good people of the town didn't like to see children out at night. It led to uncomfortable questions. At home, he slipped in through the back door, its hinges squealing slightly despite his best efforts to oil them with cooking spray. The house was dark except for the flickering blue light of the TV in the living room. His mother's soft snores told him she was passed out again. "Elijah." Ava's whisper came from the kitchen doorway. She stood there in her faded pajamas, looking smaller than any 4-year-old should. "I told you to wait upstairs," he scolded gently, but his heart lifted at the sight of her face brightening when she spotted the bag in his hands. "I couldn't sleep. My tummy hurts." "I know, Ava bug, but look what I found." He spread the food out on their cleanest kitchen towel, arranging it like a feast. "Real hamburgers from Pete's, and they're still warm." Ava's eyes widened, but then she frowned. "You have to eat too, Elijah." "I already ate," he lied smoothly, having practiced this conversation many times. "This is all for you." The memory shifted, blurring into another day, the afternoon that had led to the school vandalism incident. Elijah had been waiting to pick Ava up from her kindergarten class when he heard the commotion from inside. "Miss Ava Williams." Ms. Davis's sharp voice carried through the classroom door. "This is the 3rd time this week I've caught you sleeping during story time. What do you have to say for yourself?" Elijah peered through the classroom window, just in time to see his sister's head snap up from her desk, her eyes confused and frightened. "I'm sorry," Ava mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "I'm just really tired." "Being tired is no excuse for being disrespectful," Ms. Davis continued, her voice growing harder. "If you can't stay awake in my class, perhaps you're not ready for kindergarten. Maybe we should discuss this with your mother." Elijah watched his sister's lower lip tremble. He knew their mother wouldn't come to any meeting. She hadn't been sober enough to leave the house in weeks. And he knew why Ava was so tired. She'd been up most of the night with hunger pains, unable to sleep despite the story he'd made up about magical kingdoms where food grew on trees. That night, after Ava had finally fallen asleep, Elijah took the spray paint he'd found in their neighbor's garage. The message he left wasn't meant to be threatening. It was a desperate plea from a brother who'd run out of options. The scene dissolved again, reforming into the night of the pharmacy break-in. Ava's fever had been getting worse for days. She'd barely eaten, barely moved from her little bed. When she started talking to people who weren't there, Elijah knew he couldn't wait any longer. "Just hold on, Ava," he whispered, tucking her favorite blanket around her burning form. "I'm gonna fix this." Their mother lay sprawled on the couch downstairs, an empty bottle on the floor beside her. Elijah had tried to wake her earlier, tried to make her understand how sick Ava was, but she just mumbled something about aspirin and rolled over. Carlton's pharmacy was 3 miles away. Elijah ran the whole way, his breath making clouds in the cold night air. He knew which window had a broken lock. He checked earlier that week, just in case it came to this. The security camera caught his face as he entered, but he didn't care anymore. All that mattered was finding the right medicines, the ones advertised on TV for bringing down fevers and fighting infections. He couldn't read all the big words on the bottles, but he took several, hoping at least one would help. Earlier that same week, the bread theft had occurred. 3 days without food had left both children weak, but it was Ava's crying that finally broke him. She'd stopped asking why they were hungry, Children adapt quickly to new normals, but her quiet sobs in the night were worse than any questions. "Please," he'd beg Mrs. Green at the market counter, his voice barely a whisper. "We just need a little food. I can work. I can sweep the store or carry boxes." "Run along home," Mrs. Green had replied, not unkindly, but firmly. "This isn't a charity." So he'd stolen the bread and milk, moving quickly, knowing the security cameras would catch him, but beyond caring. That night, he'd watched Ava eat slice after slice of fresh bread, her eyes closed in bliss, and knew he'd do it again if he had to. Their kitchen told the story of Elijah's desperate attempts at caregiving. A single candle burned on the counter. They'd run out of money for the electric bill again. Over its flame, he positioned a small pot balanced on 2 bricks, trying to cook the handful of rice he'd managed to save from his school lunch. "Is it soup yet?" Ava asked hopefully, watching the pot from her perch on a wobbly kitchen chair. Her collarbone stood out sharply under her thin t-shirt, her usually bouncy curls limp and dull. "Almost," Elijah promised, stirring the rice with their one remaining spoon. "Just a few more minutes." He'd learned that adding extra water to the rice made it seem like more food, even if it was just rice soup. He'd learned a lot of tricks like that over the past months. Upstairs, their mother's bedroom door remained closed, as it had for days. Empty bottles clinked when Elijah had tried the handle earlier, but he'd stopped trying to get in, stopped trying to wake her, to make her see what was happening to her children. The scene in the kitchen was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Through the window, Elijah recognized Mrs. Martinez from next door. His heart leaped. Maybe she'd seen the lights, realized they needed help. He opened the door cautiously, hope blooming in his chest. "Are you kids alone again?" Mrs. Martinez demanded, peering past him into the dark house. "Mom's upstairs," Elijah lied automatically. "She's not feeling well." "Well, tell her to keep it down." All that crying at night. "Some of us have to work in the morning." The crying she'd heard had been Ava's hunger sobs, but Elijah just nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry." Before she left, he gathered his courage. "Mrs. Martinez? We're out of food. Could you maybe—" "Not my problem." She cut him off. "I told your mother last month. I'm not getting involved in whatever's going on here. Call social services if you need help." But Elijah knew what social services meant. It meant being separated from Ava, being put in different foster homes. He'd heard the stories from kids at school. No, they had to stay together. That night, like every night, Elijah sat on the edge of Ava's bed, stroking her hair until she fell asleep. Her breath hitched occasionally, leftover tears from another hungry evening. "I've got a secret to tell you," he whispered, though she was already drifting off. "You know how in your favorite stories, there's always a hero who protects people they love? Well, that's what big brothers do too. And I promise you, Ava, no matter what happens, I'll always protect you. Even if I have to fight dragons." She smiled slightly in her sleep, and he tucked the thin blanket more securely around her shoulders. "Even if the dragons look like empty fridges or mean teachers or dark nights. Even if protecting you means doing things that get me in trouble. Because that's what heroes do. They do whatever it takes to keep their people safe." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, pretending not to notice how warm it felt, how her skin had taken on a grayish tinge that scared him more than any darkness. "And you're my person, Ava Bug. Always will be." The next day, Elijah would try again to find help. He'd knock on every door in the neighborhood, swallowing his pride, begging for anything: food, medicine, help with the electricity bill. And one by one, they'd turn him away. "Not our problem. Can't get involved. Where's your mother in all this? Try the food bank. Call social services." Each rejection would push him closer to that final desperate night, to the pharmacy break-in that would finally bring everything crashing down. But even as they led him away in handcuffs, even as he sat silent in the courtroom, Elijah knew he'd make the same choices again. Because some promises matter more than laws. Some loves run deeper than consequences. And sometimes, the real crime isn't in the breaking and entering, the theft, or the vandalism. It's in the 1,000 small rejections that push a child to such desperate measures. In his holding cell, Elijah traced his finger over Ava's crayon drawing again. The figure she'd drawn of him wore a cape, like a superhero. She didn't understand that real heroes sometimes looked like tired 10-year-old boys with empty stomachs and full hearts, doing whatever it took to keep their promises. "I'll find a way, Ava," he whispered to the drawing. "Whatever it takes. Heroes don't give up, and neither will I." Outside his cell, the night guard paused in his rounds, thinking he heard something from the boy's room. But it was just the whisper of paper against skin, and the barely audible words of a promise being renewed in the darkness. Whatever it takes. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers early that morning, his coffee growing cold as he stared at an old photograph on his desk. The image showed a teenage boy with a rebellious smirk standing before a graffitied wall. Himself, 40 years ago. His father's words still echoed in his ears. "Boy, you'll learn discipline one way or another. The easy way or the hard way." He'd chosen the hard way back then, earning himself a stint in juvenile detention that changed the course of his life. His father, a career military man, had refused to bail him out, refused to make excuses. "Actions have consequences," he'd said. "Best you learn that now." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Your Honor?" "They're ready to begin." Harrison slipped the photo back into his desk drawer. He'd learned his lesson the hard way, and it had made him a better man. Sometimes tough love was the only kind that worked. The courtroom was packed as he took his seat at the bench. Elijah Williams sat at the defendant's table, still looking impossibly small in his orange jumpsuit. District Attorney Chin stood ready for her final arguments, her expression confident. "Your Honor," she began, "over the past 2 days, we have established a clear pattern of escalating criminal behavior. The defendant has shown a blatant disregard for property rights, public safety, and the law itself. His breaking and entering at Carlton's pharmacy put not only himself, but our entire community at risk." She approached the jury box, her voice growing more emphatic. "We cannot allow sympathy for his age to cloud our judgment. Each crime has grown more serious than the last. What begins with shoplifting has progressed to breaking and entering. What starts with stealing food has evolved to stealing controlled substances. Where will it end?" Harrison watched Elijah's public defender shift uncomfortably in his chair. The boy hadn't given him much to work with. "The community needs to feel safe," Chin continued. "Business owners need to know their properties are protected. Parents need to know their children won't be influenced by this kind of behavior. We're asking for the maximum allowable sentence under juvenile law, with mandatory counseling and strict supervision upon release." Judge Harrison leaned forward, fixing his gaze on Elijah. "Young man, before I hear from your attorney, I'd like to address you directly." Elijah lifted his head slightly, but didn't meet the judge's eyes. "I've been where you are," Harrison began, his voice stern but not unkind. "I've sat in that same chair, thinking the whole world was against me, thinking nobody understood. But understanding isn't what you need right now. What you need is to realize that this path you're on leads nowhere good." He gestured to the gallery. "Look around you. These are your neighbors, your community. Every time you broke into a store, every time you vandalized property, you weren't just breaking laws, you were breaking their trust. Actions have consequences, son. It's time you learned that lesson." The courtroom was silent, waiting for Elijah's response. For 2 days, he'd said nothing, offered no defense, shown no remorse. Everyone expected more of the same. But something had changed. Maybe it was the judge's words about community, about neighbors. Maybe it was the weight of all his secrets finally becoming too heavy to bear. Whatever the reason, Elijah Williams found his voice. It wasn't vandalism. The words were so soft, so unexpected, that at first people weren't sure they'd heard them. "Speak up, son," Judge Harrison commanded, leaning forward. Elijah's hands trembled, but his voice grew stronger. "The wall at school. It wasn't vandalism. I wasn't trying to be bad." D.H. started to object, but Harrison waved her down, his eyes fixed on the boy who'd finally broken his silence. "Ms. Davis." Elijah's voice caught, but he forced himself to continue. "She yelled at my sister for falling asleep in class. But Ava wasn't being bad either. She was just so hungry." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Ms. Davis, sitting in the gallery, straightened in her seat. "She's only 4, Elijah continued, his words coming faster now. "She tried to stay awake, but we hadn't. There wasn't." He swallowed hard. "I wrote on the wall because I didn't know how else to tell someone. Nobody would listen." Judge Harrison's expression changed, almost imperceptibly. The stern mask slipped, revealing something like concern. "Tell someone what, Elijah?" But the boy had retreated back into silence, his brief courage spent. It was then that Ms. Thompson, the social worker who'd been present at Elijah's arrest, stepped forward. "Your Honor, if I may?" Harrison nodded, grateful for the interruption as he tried to process this new information. Ms. Thompson took the stand, her gray hair neatly pinned back, her expression grave. "I've been a social worker in this community for 23 years, Your Honor. The night of Elijah's arrest, I conducted an inspection of the Williams residence. What I found was disturbing." She consulted her notebook, though it was clear she didn't need to. These details were burned into her memory. The house had no electricity. It had been shut off weeks before due to unpaid bills. No running water. No working heat. The refrigerator contained a single packet of ketchup and half a bottle of expired milk. In the children's rooms, I found... She paused, composing herself. "I found evidence that Elijah had been trying to cook rice over candles. The beds had no proper blankets, just old coats piled up for warmth. The courtroom had grown deathly quiet. Even D.A. Chin looked uncomfortable. In the master bedroom, I found Mrs. Williams unconscious, surrounded by empty alcohol bottles. The bathroom cabinet contained no children's medicine, no Band-Aids, not even soap. But in Ava's room, I found something that I believe the court needs to see." She reached into her bag and pulled out a child's drawing. "Ava drew this in my office yesterday. She called it Elijah being a superhero." The drawing showed a stick figure with a cape, standing in front of what appeared to be a store. In a child's wobbly handwriting, it read, "My brother gets food for me when I'm hungry." Judge Harrison accepted the drawing, studying it with new eyes. He looked at Elijah, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. The oversized jumpsuit didn't make him look small. He realized the boy was small. Too small for 10 years old. And thin. How had he not noticed how thin the child was? In the gallery, people were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Green, the grocery store owner who'd testified about the bread theft, stared at her hands. Mr. Peterson, who'd complained about finding Elijah in his garbage cans, cleared his throat repeatedly. Ms. Thompson wasn't finished. "Your Honor, in my professional opinion, what we're dealing with here isn't a case of juvenile delinquency. This is a case of severe neglect, poverty, and a child forced to take on responsibilities no 10-year-old should have to bear." She turned to look at Elijah, her voice softening. This young boy wasn't vandalizing property for fun or stealing for thrills. He was desperately trying to take care of his little sister in the only ways he could figure out. Mrs. Martinez, who'd testified about Elijah's late-night activities, suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, I need to amend my testimony." Harrison nodded, still holding Ava's drawing. "Those noises I complained about, the crying at night, I said it was loud music and parties, but..." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I think it might have been a little girl, crying because she was hungry. Elijah did come to my door once, asking for food. I turned him away. I didn't want to get involved." Her voice broke on the last word, and she sat down heavily, her face in her hands. One by one, other neighbors began to shift and mumble, remembering times they'd seen signs but looked the other way. Times they'd assumed the worst instead of asking questions. Times they'd chosen not to get involved. Judge Harrison looked down at his notes, seeing them with new eyes. Every incident, every crime, began to take on a different shape. The grocery store theft, bread and milk, basic necessities. The pharmacy break-in, children's medicine, fever reducers, nothing that could be sold on the street. Even the school vandalism, not a threat, but a cry for help. He thought of his own past, of his father's tough love approach. But he'd never gone hungry, never had to take care of a younger sibling, never had to choose between following the law and watching someone he loved suffer. "Miss Thompson," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "What is Ava's condition now?" "She's been placed with an emergency foster family, Your Honor. They took her to a doctor yesterday. She's malnourished, anemic, and showing signs of recent illness. But she's receiving proper care now." Ms. Thompson paused. She asked for her brother constantly. More faces in the gallery dropped. More throats were cleared uncomfortably. D.H. and shuffled her papers, looking less certain of her call for maximum penalties. Judge Harrison turned back to Elijah, his voice gentler than before. "Son, why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you ask for help?" For a moment, it seemed Elijah would retreat into silence again. But then he spoke, his voice small but clear. "I did. I asked everyone, but they said they'd take Ava away, put us in different homes. I promised I'd always protect her." The words hung in the air, simple but devastating in their truth. In the gallery, Mrs. Green began to cry softly, remembering how she'd dismissed Elijah's offer to work for food. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. The photograph in his desk drawer flashed through his mind, his teenage self, smirking at the camera, full of rebellion, but never real desperation. Never hunger. Never fear for a loved one's survival. "Your Honor," Mr. Rodriguez spoke up, "in light of these revelations, I move that we recess until tomorrow. I believe there's much more to my client's story that the court needs to hear." Harrison nodded slowly, replacing his glasses. "Granted. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. He paused, then added, "And Ms. Thompson, please ensure that Elijah receives a proper meal tonight. And," he held up Ava's drawing, "make sure he knows his sister is safe and being cared for." As the bailiff let Elijah out, the boy glanced back once at Ms. Thompson, a question in his eyes that broke every heart in the room. "Can I see Ava?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Soon, sweetheart. Soon." The courtroom emptied slowly, people lingering as if waiting for someone to tell them what to do with their guilt, their shifting assumptions, their dawning understanding of what had really been happening in their community. Judge Harrison remained at his bench long after everyone had gone, staring at Ava's drawing of her superhero brother. Finally, he reached for his phone and dialed a number. "Janet? It's Mike Harrison. Listen, about that opening at the youth center. Yes, I know you've been asking for funding for years. Well, I think it's time we had a serious discussion about that. No child in our community should ever have to—" He looked at the drawing again. "No child should ever have to be their own superhero." The morning sun filtered through the courtroom's high windows, casting long shadows across Elijah Williams' small frame as he took the stand. After yesterday's revelation about the school graffiti, the courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his usual stern expression softened by what he'd learned the previous day. "Elijah, are you ready to tell us your story?" Elijah glanced at Ms. Thompson, who gave him an encouraging nod. He'd spent the evening talking with her, finally letting out the truth he'd kept bottled up for so long. She'd held him as he cried, promising that speaking up wouldn't mean losing Ava forever. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silent courtroom, everyone could hear him clearly. "Take your time, son," Harrison said gently. "Start wherever you feel comfortable." Elijah's fingers twisted in the fabric of his jumpsuit. It started getting really bad about 6 months ago. Mom lost her job at the diner, and then the bills started piling up. At first she really did. She'd go out looking for work every day. He swallowed hard. But then she started drinking more. She'd say she was going for job interviews, but she'd come home different. Some days she wouldn't come home at all. In the gallery, several people shifted uncomfortably, remembering seeing Mrs. Williams stumbling down the street, ignoring their judgmental stares. The food started running out, Elijah continued, his voice growing stronger as he focused on the facts. First it was just little things like no more snacks or juice. Then the milk would be gone, and we'd have only bread. Then even the bread was gone. He looked down at his hands. Ava didn't understand. She's only 4. She just knew she was hungry. She'd cry at night, holding her stomach, asking when Mommy was coming home with groceries. I tried telling her stories to distract her, tried making games out of drinking water to feel full, but his voice cracked. Mr. Rodriguez offered him a glass of water, but Elijah shook his head, determined to continue. "The first time I stole something, it was a loaf of bread from Mrs. Green's store. Ava hadn't eaten in 2 days. I tried asking Mrs. Green for work, offered to sweep or stack shelves, anything. But she said no. I watched Ava trying to lick the empty peanut butter jar clean, and I couldn't watch her be hungry anymore." Mrs. Green, sitting in the gallery, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The memory of dismissing Elijah's desperate offer now felt like a stone in her stomach. "After that, it got easier to take things. Not because I wanted to steal, but because Ava's crying hurt worse than feeling guilty. I learned which stores had cameras and which didn't. I figured out when the delivery trucks came so I'd know which dumpsters might have fresh food. Judge Harrison's pen had stopped moving across his notepad. He sat perfectly still, listening as Elijah's story unfolded. But then Ava got sick. Elijah's voice trembled. Really sick. She had this fever that wouldn't go away. I tried everything. Cool washcloths, making her drink water, even the baby aspirin I found in the bathroom cabinet. But she just got worse. The boy's composure began to crack as he recalled those terrifying nights. She was burning up, talking to people who weren't there. I tried to wake Mom, showed her how hot Ava was, but she just mumbled something about sleep it off and went back to her room. I could hear the bottles clinking when she closed the door. Elijah wiped his eyes with his sleeve. That night, Ava started shaking. Her eyes were all glassy, and she didn't know who I was. She kept calling for Mom, but not like she usually did. This time she sounded scared, like she was having a nightmare, but her eyes were open. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word. I knew the pharmacy had medicine. I'd seen the commercials about fever reducers and stuff for kids. I waited until it was really late, found the window with the broken lock. He looked directly at Mr. Carlton, the pharmacy owner. "I'm sorry about the window, sir. I tried not to break anything else. I just needed medicine for Ava." Mr. Carlton, who had been one of the loudest voices calling for harsh punishment, found himself unable to meet Elijah's gaze. I didn't know which medicines were right, so I took several kinds. I was scared of giving her the wrong thing, but I was more scared of not giving her anything. She was so hot, and I remembered learning in school that really high fevers can make people die. His voice broke completely on the last word. Ms. Thompson handed him a tissue, and Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, but Elijah shook his head. "I need to finish," he insisted. "Please." The judge nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. I stayed up all night with her, putting cold washcloths on her head like they do on TV. I read all the medicine bottles really carefully and gave her the children's fever medicine. I was so scared of giving her too much, but by morning, her fever started going down. Elijah's hands had stopped shaking. As he spoke about caring for Ava, his voice grew stronger, more confident. This was his purpose, the thing he knew he did right. The electricity got cut off next, then the water. Mom would disappear for days sometimes, coming back only to get more clothes or whatever she could sell. I learned to cook rice on candles, learned which neighbors had spigots in their yards where I could fill water bottles at night. He described the endless nights of trying to keep Ava warm without heat, of washing her clothes in the park fountain, of making up stories about why Mommy wasn't there to tuck her in. Some nights, she'd ask if Mom didn't love us anymore. I told her Mom was sick, that she needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. I didn't want Ava to stop loving her, even if he couldn't finish the sentence. District Attorney Chun, who had been planning to cross-examine Elijah aggressively, quietly closed her notebook. I tried asking the neighbors for help, Elijah continued. But everyone said they didn't want to get involved. Some said they'd call social services, but I knew what that meant. My friend Tommy at school got put in foster care last year. They sent him and his sister to different homes. They haven't seen each other in months. He looked directly at Judge Harrison, his young face aged by worry and responsibility. "Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong. I know stealing is bad. But Ava, she's all I have. She needs me. When she cries, I'm the one who knows how to make her feel better. When she has nightmares, she calls for me, not Mom. I promised I'd always protect her." Tears were flowing freely in the gallery now. Mrs. Martinez, who had testified about the late-night noises, was openly sobbing. "Please," Elijah's voice cracked again. "You can punish me. I deserve it. But please don't punish Ava by taking me away from her. She's just a little girl. She needs her big brother." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. When he looked up, his eyes were red. Just then, Mrs. Green stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to withdraw my complaint about the theft." And she took a deep breath. "I'd like to offer Elijah a job at my store. A real one, with fair pay." He was right. I do need help with stocking and cleaning. Mr. Carlton stood next to her. "I'm withdrawing my complaint as well." And I'd like to establish a program at my pharmacy for families who can't afford medicine. No child should have to break in to get care for their sister. One by one, the business owners who had testified against Elijah stood up, withdrawing their complaints, offering help instead of condemnation. The same community that had been so quick to judge was now racing to make amends. Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion. Elijah Williams, he began, then stopped, removing his glasses again. When he continued, his tone was unlike anything the regular courtroom attendees had ever heard from him. Elijah, I owe you an apology. This court owes you an apology. This entire community owes you an apology. We looked at your actions, but never asked about your reasons. We saw a criminal where we should have seen a child drowning in responsibilities no child should have to bear. He looked out at the gallery. We pride ourselves on being a close-knit community, on knowing our neighbors. But we failed. We failed spectacularly. We turned away a child asking for help because we didn't want to get involved. Well, consider us involved now. The judge turned back to Elijah. Son, your actions were wrong in the eyes of the law, but your heart was truer than any I've seen in this courtroom. You did what you thought you had to do to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. That's not delinquency. That's love in its purest, most desperate form. Elijah's shoulders began to shake as the tears he'd been holding back finally broke free. Ms. Thompson moved to stand behind him, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. This case is far from over, Judge Harrison continued. There are serious issues to address: your mother's addiction, your living situation, proper care for both you and Ava. But I want you to understand something. You are not a criminal. You are a survivor. And from this moment forward, you don't have to survive alone anymore. He looked out at the gallery again, his gaze stern once more. This community failed these children once. I expect every person in this room to ensure we never fail them again. The silence that followed was heavy with promise and shame, with revelation and resolve. In that moment, something shifted in the courtroom, not just in how they saw Elijah Williams, but in how they saw themselves. The 10-year-old boy who had entered the courtroom as a juvenile delinquent had transformed before their eyes into what he truly was: a child who had borne the weight of adult responsibilities with grace and determination, a brother whose love had driven him to desperate measures, a survivor who had done the wrong things for all the right reasons. And in the gallery, a community began to understand that sometimes justice isn't about punishment at all. Sometimes it's about healing. Sometimes it's about helping a 10-year-old boy lay down a burden that was never his to carry alone. The morning after Elijah's testimony, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls, their expressions troubled as they whispered among themselves. Many had been there yesterday to hear Elijah's heartbreaking story, and they'd spent a sleepless night wrestling with their consciences. Mrs. Martinez sat in the front row, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of distress. Her husband touched her hand gently. "It's not your fault, Maria, isn't it?" she whispered back. "I heard that child crying night after night. I convinced myself it was just kids being noisy, but deep down, I knew something was wrong, and I did nothing." Around the courtroom, similar conversations were taking place. Mr. Peterson, who had complained about finding Elijah in his garbage cans, now recalled how the boy had always carefully retied the bags, even leaving them neater than he'd found them. Mrs. Thompson from the corner store remembered how Elijah would stare longingly at the day-old bread she threw out, but had never caused trouble, never begged, just watched with those hungry eyes. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. "All rise." Judge Harrison entered, followed by Ms. Thompson, the social worker. But it was the small figure walking beside her that caught everyone's attention. 4-year-old Ava Williams, wearing a clean but too large dress, her dark curls neatly braided, looked around the courtroom with wide, uncertain eyes. "Elijah," her small voice quavered. The door to the holding area opened, and Elijah appeared, still in his orange jumpsuit. The siblings' eyes met across the room, and Ava broke away from Ms. Thompson, running toward her brother. "Elijah! Elijah!" The bailiff moved to intercept her, but Judge Harrison held up his hand. "Let them be." Elijah dropped to his knees as Ava crashed into him, wrapping her thin arms around his neck. "I missed you so much," she sobbed. "The new lady is nice, but she doesn't tell stories right. She doesn't do the voices like you do. A sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob escaped Elijah as he held his sister. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as he gently wiped her tears away, straightened her dress, checked her forehead for fever with practiced concern. "Have you been eating?" he asked softly. "Are you feeling better?" Ava nodded. "They gave me medicine that didn't taste yucky. And real food, not just rice soup. But I saved some for you." She dug in her pocket and pulled out a slightly squashed cookie wrapped in a napkin. Elijah's face crumpled at this evidence that his sister was still trying to take care of him. Even now, in the gallery, several people turned away, wiping their eyes. Mrs. Martinez suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Harrison nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I need to tell the truth about what I saw, what I ignored." Her voice shook, but grew stronger as she continued. "Elijah came to my door at least 5 times asking for help. Once, it was snowing, and he didn't even have a proper coat. He asked if I had any extra blankets because Ava was cold." She paused, dabbing at her eyes. "I told him it wasn't my problem. I had extra blankets. I had food. I had everything those children needed. But I didn't want to get involved. I was afraid of legal liability, afraid of their mother, afraid of responsibility. I told myself someone else would help them." She turned to face the courtroom. "But nobody did. We all chose to look the other way. We're all guilty of failing these children." From the back of the courtroom, a deep voice spoke up. "Not anymore." Reverend Michael Johnson, pastor of the First Baptist Church, made his way to the front. He was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes, known throughout the community for his outreach programs. "Your Honor, my congregation has been blessed with resources we haven't been using properly. We have a small house next to the church that was meant to be a youth center. With the court's permission, I'd like to offer it to Elijah and Ava, rent-free, for as long as they need it." Murmurs of approval rippled through the courtroom as the pastor continued. "We can provide utilities, food, clothing, everything these children need. Our congregation includes doctors, teachers, counselors. We're ready to wrap our arms around this family and give them the support they should have had all along." Ms. Thompson stepped forward, her face brightening with hope. "Your Honor, this could be the solution we've been looking for. Instead of placing the children in separate foster homes, we could keep them together under community supervision. With proper support and monitoring, plus mandatory counseling and education support." The prosecutor, D.A. Chun, stood up. Her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something more thoughtful. "Your Honor, in light of these developments and—" She glanced at Ava, still clinging to her brother. "The extraordinary circumstances of this case, the state wishes to withdraw the most serious charges." She shuffled her papers, then added more quietly, "We would also recommend that any remaining charges be handled through community service, perhaps working with the church's youth program to help other children in similar situations." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, surveying the scene before him. Elijah stood with his arm protectively around Ava, hope and fear battling in his expression. The community members who had testified against him days ago now stood ready to help. A transformation was taking place in his courtroom, not just of one case, but of an entire community's heart. "Before I make my ruling," he said, "I want to address something Elijah said yesterday. He spoke about hearing his friend Tommy hasn't seen his sister in months since they were placed in separate foster homes." The judge paused, making eye contact with Elijah. "Son, I want you to know I'm going to look into Tommy's case personally. No siblings should be separated if there's any way to keep them together." Elijah's eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time since his arrest, a small smile flickered across his face. "As for your case," the judge continued, "I'm going to delay formal sentencing for 6 months. During that time, here's what's going to happen." He began listing points on his fingers. "First, you and Ava will be placed in the church's house, under Ms. Thompson's supervision. Second, you'll both receive full medical checkups and any necessary treatment. Third, you'll attend counseling sessions, both individually and together. Fourth, you'll continue your education, with tutoring to help you catch up on anything you've missed." The judge looked stern for a moment. "You will also complete 100 hours of community service, but not as punishment. Instead, You'll work with Reverend Johnson to help set up a new program at the youth center, one specifically designed to identify and help other children in crisis. Elijah nodded solemnly, but Ava tugged at his jumpsuit. Can I help too? She whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, bringing tears and gentle laughter to the courtroom. Of course you can, sweetheart, Judge Harrison smiled. Then his expression grew serious again. As for your mother, she will be ordered to complete rehabilitation and parenting classes before any consideration of reunification. But that's not something either of you need to worry about right now. Your job is to be children, just children. He looked out of the gallery. And our job, all of us, is to make sure we never let children slip through the cracks again. I'm ordering the creation of a community task force to develop better systems for identifying and helping families in crisis. Mrs. Martinez, would you be willing to lead that initiative? She stood up straighter, nodding firmly. Yes, Your Honor. I won't look away again. Good. Now, does anyone else wish to speak before we conclude? One by one, community members stood up, offering help. Mrs. Green promising to stock the kitchen with fresh food every week. Mr. Carlton offering to provide all necessary medications. Teachers volunteering to tutor. Mothers offering to babysit. Fathers offering to teach Elijah basic home repairs. The same community that had been so quick to condemn was now competing to help, each person trying to make amends in their own way. Judge Harrison finally raised his hand for quiet. Elijah, do you understand everything that's been discussed here? The boy looked around at all the faces now smiling at him encouragingly, then down at his sister, who beamed up at him with complete trust. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Don't thank me, son. This is what community is supposed to be. We just forgot that for a while. You and Ava reminded us. As if on cue, the entire courtroom rose to their feet, breaking into applause. Ava, startled by the noise, pressed closer to Elijah, who hugged her protectively. It's okay, he whispered to her. They're clapping because they're happy, like in your stories when the hero wins. But you're the hero, she said firmly. Ms. Thompson approached them, smiling warmly. Are you ready to see your new home? Ava bounced excitedly, but Elijah hesitated. What about my jumpsuit? I don't have any other clothes. Reverend Johnson stepped forward, holding out a small duffel bag. The congregation took care of that. We guessed at the sizes, but we can get anything you need. As Ms. Thompson led them toward the door, the applause continued. Judge Harrison watched them go, noting how Elijah's shoulders had finally relaxed, how he no longer looked like he was carrying the weight of the world alone. Outside the courtroom, a small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, teachers, store owners, all wanted to show their support. The local media was there too, but this time their cameras captured a very different scene. Not a juvenile delinquent being led away in handcuffs, but two siblings walking toward a future bright with promise and possibility. Mrs. Martinez fell into step beside them. I cleared out my garden shed yesterday, she said casually. Found those blankets Elijah asked for. They're washed and ready, along with some other things I should have shared months ago. Elijah looked up at her, and in that moment, something passed between them. Forgiveness offered and accepted, bridges rebuilt, community restored. As they reached the courthouse steps, Ava tugged at her brother's hand. Elijah, can we have rice soup sometimes? Even though we don't have to. He looked at her in surprise. But we can have real food now. Why would you want rice soup? She shrugged. Because you made it for me. It was like magic soup. It made me feel better even when I was really hungry. Miss Thompson saw Elijah's eyes fill with tears and quickly stepped in. How about we learn to cook together? All of us. We can make rice soup for special occasions, and lots of other things too. As they walked toward the waiting cars, the applause finally faded, replaced by the sounds of a community in action. People organizing schedules, exchanging phone numbers, planning meals and tutoring sessions and support groups. The story of Elijah Williams had begun as a tale of juvenile delinquency, but had transformed into something else entirely. A wake-up call, a redemption story, and most importantly, a beginning rather than an end. Back in his chambers, Judge Harrison made one final note in Elijah's file. Sometimes the most important judgment is the one we make about ourselves. Then he picked up his phone to begin looking into Tommy's case, determined to help another family heal. Outside, The sun shone brightly on a community forever changed by a 10-year-old boy who had taught them all what it truly means to take care of each other. The small house next to First Baptist Church had undergone a remarkable transformation in just 1 week. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new curtains hung in sparkling windows, and the previously empty rooms now held carefully chosen furniture. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed softly, fully stocked with fresh food. The pantry shelves sagged under the weight of donated groceries. Elijah stood in what was now his bedroom, running his hand over the blue comforter on his new bed. After weeks in a holding cell, the softness beneath his fingers felt almost unreal. Through the wall, he could hear Ava chattering happily with Ms. Thompson as they arranged stuffed animals on her own bed, more toys than she'd ever owned in her life. "Is it really okay?" he asked Reverend Johnson, who stood in the doorway. "All of this, it seems like too much." The pastor smiled kindly. "This is what community is supposed to be, son. Besides, most of this was just sitting in people's attics and spare rooms. Seems to me these things found their proper home." A delighted squeal from Ava's room made both of them smile. Miss Thompson appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, but beaming. "That sister of yours has enough energy for 3 children now that she's getting proper meals. Speaking of which, dinner's in an hour. Why don't you get settled in while I start cooking?" Elijah's face fell slightly. Can I help with dinner? I know how to cook some things." Miss Thompson and Reverend Johnson exchanged glances, understanding the deeper meaning behind his request. Old habits of caring for Ava wouldn't disappear overnight. "Of course you can help," Miss Thompson said gently. "But not because you have to. Only if you want to." A knock at the front door interrupted them. Judge Harrison stood on the porch, looking different in casual clothes instead of his judicial robes. He held a large paper bag in his arms. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, then smiled as Ava came racing down the hallway. "Mr. Judge," she called out, having decided this was his proper title. "Come see my room. I have a unicorn, and he has sparkly hair, and—" "Ava," Elijah started to scold, his old protective instincts kicking in, but Judge Harrison was already being pulled down the hallway by his small tour guide. "And this is Elijah's room," Ava announced, poking her head into her brother's doorway. "He has a desk for homework and everything." Judge Harrison took in the simple but comfortable room, noting the art supplies carefully arranged on the desk, a donation from the local school's art teacher. "Very nice. Actually, Elijah, I brought something that might be useful for that desk." He held out the paper bag. Inside was a laptop computer, not new but in good condition. "It's my son's old one. He's in college now and insisted on upgrading, but this one works perfectly. I thought it might help with your studies." Elijah stared at the computer with wide eyes. "Sir, I can't." "You can," the judge said firmly. "And you will. Consider it an investment in your future." Later that evening, after a proper dinner around a real table, Judge Harrison sat with Elijah on the back porch while Ava helped Miss Thompson bake cookies inside. The spring air was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and distant church bells. "How are you really doing, son?" the judge asked quietly. Elijah was silent for a moment, considering. "It's strange. Good strange, but strange. I keep waiting for something to go wrong. Keep thinking I need to save food or check on Ava, or—" "It's going to take time," Harrison said. "You carried adult responsibilities for so long, it's going to feel odd to just be a kid again. But that's your only job now. That and letting us help." Inside, they could hear Ava laughing at something Miss Thompson said. The sound made Elijah smile, even as tears formed in his eyes. "I've never heard her laugh like that before," he whispered. The next few weeks brought constant changes. The community's generosity seemed endless. Every day brought new donations: clothes, books, school supplies, toys. Mrs. Green from the grocery store arranged for weekly food deliveries. Mr. Carlton from the pharmacy set up a medical account for both children. But more importantly, people gave their time. Mrs. Martinez organized a rotating schedule of volunteers to help with everything from cooking to homework supervision. The local dentist provided free checkups. A hairdresser came to trim and style Ava's curls, making her giggle with delight at her reflection. Elijah's education became a top priority. His new tutor, Ms. Rebecca Andrews, quickly discovered that despite his spotty attendance, he was remarkably bright. "Your reading comprehension is extraordinary," she told him during their third session. "And your creativity. Have you ever thought about becoming a writer?" Elijah looked down at the story he'd written, a simple tale about a brother and sister who found magical food growing in their backyard. "I used to make up stories for Ava when she was hungry. It helped sometimes, making her imagine she was eating feast food instead of rice soup." Ms. Andrews wiped away a tear before Elijah could notice. "Well, you have quite a talent. Would you like to learn how to write them properly? With dialogue and description and all the tools real authors use." For the first time, Elijah looked truly excited about something for himself, not just for Ava's sake. The changes in both children were remarkable. Ava, with proper nutrition and medical care, transformed from a wan, quiet child into a bubbling fountain of energy and curiosity. Her cheeks filled out, her curls regained their bounce, and her laughter became a constant soundtrack in the little house. "Look, Elijah," she called out one afternoon, spinning in the backyard. "I can twirl without getting dizzy now. The doctor said it's because I'm eating growing food." Elijah, watching from the porch while working on a new story, smiled at her joy. His own transformation was subtler, but no less profound. While still protective of Ava, he was slowly learning to relax, to trust that others would help care for her. His own health improved, and with it came a growth spurt that finally put him in the normal range for his age. But the most significant change was in his creativity. Once he no longer had to focus all his energy on survival, his natural talents began to flourish. His stories, initially simple tales to distract Ava from hunger, evolved into rich narratives that caught the attention of his teachers. One evening, he showed Judge Harrison, who had made a habit of weekly visits, a story he'd written for school. "It's about a community that forgets how to see each other," he explained shyly. "But then something happens that makes them remember, and they all start helping each other again." The judge read it carefully, recognizing the parallel to their own town's transformation. "This is really good, Elijah. Really good. Have you shown it to anyone else? Ms. Andrews says I should enter it in the state writing contest for students." But what?" Elijah fidgeted with his pencil. "But what if people don't like reading about hard things? About hunger and being scared and stuff?" Judge Harrison set the story down carefully. "Sometimes the hardest stories are the ones people need to hear the most. Your story has already changed this town more than you know." He was right. The case of Elijah and Ava Williams had sparked a larger conversation throughout the community. The local newspaper ran a series on hidden poverty in their midst. The town council established a food bank and emergency assistance program. The school system implemented a new protocol for identifying students who might be struggling with hunger or neglect. Mrs. Martinez's task force grew into a full-fledged community outreach organization. They found other children who needed help, other families struggling in silence. The town that had once turned away from a desperate child now prided itself on making sure no one fell through the cracks. One bright Saturday morning, exactly 2 months after moving into their new home, Elijah stood before the youth group at First Baptist Church. His hands shook slightly as he held his notes, but his voice was clear. "My story isn't special," he began. "There are kids like me and Ava in every town and every school. They're trying to be invisible because they're scared of being separated from the people they love. They're ashamed to ask for help because sometimes asking doesn't work, and that hurts worse than not asking at all." The room was silent. Every face turned toward him. "But I learned something important. I learned that sometimes people want to help but don't know how. Sometimes they're scared too, scared of doing the wrong thing, scared of getting involved. But being scared isn't an excuse for looking away. I know that now." He glanced at Ava, who sat in the front row between Ms. Thompson and Judge Harrison, beaming up at him with pride. "So, I made a promise to myself. I promised I'd never be quiet again when I see someone hurting. I promised I'd use my voice, not just for Ava this time, but for anyone who needs help being heard. Because everyone deserves a community that sees them, really sees them, and refuses to look away." As he stepped down from the podium, the applause was thunderous. But more meaningful were the quiet conversations that followed, the teenagers coming forward to share their own stories or concerns about friends who might need help. That evening, as Ms. Thompson served dinner, with Elijah's help, because he still liked to cook, Judge Harrison made an announcement. "I have some news about Tommy, your friend who was separated from his sister. Well, thanks to the new policies we've put in place, They're being reunited next week. They'll be placed together with a foster family right here in town. Elijah's fork clattered to his plate. Really? They can be together again? Really? And that's not all. Remember that story you wrote? It won first place in the state contest. The prize includes a scholarship for college. Ava jumped up from her chair to hug her brother. That means you can be a real writer. You can write stories about us and help people understand and make things better. Elijah hugged her back, his eyes meeting Judge Harrison's over her curly head. The judge raised his water glass in a silent toast, and Elijah smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. Later that night, after Ava was asleep in her room, surrounded by her beloved stuffed animals, Elijah sat at his desk working on a news story. Through his window, he could see the lights of the town twinkling under the stars. The same town that had once seemed so cold and uncaring now felt like a warm embrace. He picked up his pencil and began to write. Once there was a boy who thought he had to carry the whole world on his shoulders. He didn't know that sometimes the bravest thing isn't carrying the weight alone, but letting others help you bear it. He didn't know that sometimes the strongest voice isn't the one that stays silent to protect secrets, but the one that speaks up to protect others. But he learned, and when he did, he discovered that every ending can be a beginning, if you're brave enough to turn the page. Ms. Thompson, checking on him one last time before bed, found him asleep at his desk, pencil still in hand, peaceful smile on his face. On the wall above his desk hung a new drawing from Ava, a picture of their little house next to the church, surrounded by smiling people, with the words, "Our family," written in her best kindergarten handwriting. The story of Elijah and Ava Williams didn't end with the court case, or even with their new home. It continued to ripple outward, touching other lives, changing other stories, reminding an entire community that sometimes the most important transformations begin with simply opening our eyes, our hearts, and our doors to those in need. And in a small house next to First Baptist Church, two children who had once survived on rice soup and desperate love now thrived on community, opportunity, and the kind of hope that comes from knowing you're not alone anymore. The end was really just a beginning. What would you do to protect someone you love? Elijah's story reminds us that sometimes the most heroic acts come from the most unexpected places, and that true justice requires us to look beyond what we first see. If this story of a brother's sacrifice and a community's awakening touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories that celebrate the triumph of the human spirit. Until next time, remember, every child deserves a voice, and every voice deserves to be heard. See you in the next one.